Hello, this is Dazzling One, and this week's discussion is on trauma, sex, and Jezebel. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, emotional shock following a stressful event, or physical injury, which may be associated with physical shock and sometimes lead to a strong neurosis. The older I get, and the more I look at my own experiences, I realize that most of the trauma I experienced was psychological and emotional. And it took me a long time to realize just the value of 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. And what I came to realize is that I tried my hardest to suppress how I felt by denying that I was upset, by denying I was angry, that I was sad, and that I needed to cry, and that sometimes I needed to shout and let it out. Not that I wanted to lose control and be a victim, but you have to bleed out that toxin. And when you do so, you're cleansed of it. And I cast all my cares, all my hurt upon him, upon Yahweh or God. And one of the reasons why I was so hesitant to do so is because I grew up with this misconception that emotions were not a good thing. And the reason is because every time that I cried and every time that I was upset or was too excited, it came with a price. I was yelled at, I was humiliated, embarrassed, and told that it needed to stop right then and there. And I had an experience about a week ago with the perpetrator of my past trauma, and I started to cry because they were doing what they always do to upset me, and I actually confronted them about this, and they immediately told me, stop crying, get rid of those tears. And for once I was like, you know what, I have a right to cry. I'm an adult. And they try to shame me. You're 22 years old, you're so weak and sensitive. And I realized just the narcissism behind everything they were saying. But I also realized that I had been fooling myself all this time to feel ashamed of something that was natural. And so I stood up for myself, and I don't regret it. Not that I like to lose control and argue, because I really try to prevent it if I can, but sometimes we do have to stand up for ourselves and let it all out. And I prayed about it, and I went to Yahweh about it, and I feel so much better. In Psalms 55:22, cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. Again, it tells us that if we cast our cares upon him, we need to be honest with him. Coming to him and pretending like we're okay when we're not is like coming to your best friend and acting as if nothing's the matter when they can clearly see that something is. And that's something that I made the mistake of doing, because you get in this habit when you're a victim of emotional abuse to hide the fact that you're being abused and to put on mask and to act. And it's something I didn't get around to saying in the Hex video that I did, but all forms of abuse are witchcraft, and the reason why is because it involves control, manipulation, and oftentimes violence is another form of manipulation, as well as just verbally putting someone down. When you constantly call people names, it's like putting curses upon them, and it's not right. And many of us are introduced to witchcraft through that form of trauma as well. It's not just some physically unattractive elderly witch with a huge cauldron stirring a bunch of goo around. It's deeper than that, and I feel that's one way I was introduced to it, and what opened the door to a lot of the demonic attacks, because it's easy when that happens to you to form a lot of unforgiveness, condemnation, anger, bitterness, guilt that shouldn't be there in the first place. And it's not one's fault, but if they're not careful, they're unable to detect it. So my advice for anyone who's suffered any type of trauma, whether current or past, and it's bothering you, is to cast your cares upon Yahweh. And I know that sounds so cliche and so simple, but I did that, and when I came to him and I was 100% honest, I noticed that there were more changes. And I can't control or change the way the person that hurt me is, and I can see that they don't really care what they did. They blame me for my own childhood abuse, but that's okay. because I realized that it's in Yahweh's hands, and that's what I wanted to share with you as far as trauma goes. With sexual sin, I was watching the movie Hellraiser, and many look at it for the Saturn cube, and if you look into the whole Saturn research, there's a lot of great YouTube channels out there who've covered this, but I want to talk about the sexual sin element. So back in September, I mentioned It Follows and how you could use that movie to kind of envision what happens when you sexually sin. Another good movie, in my opinion, is Hellraiser. And the reason Hellraiser is a good example is because you have these demons who are summoned by blood, which blood, the life is in the blood, and it brings them there, but it's this woman's lust to be with this man she committed adultery with, to bring him back, that leads her to commit all these murders. And then this man is still sadistic and perverted, even in his miserable state that he's in, and he's even willing to commit incest with his own niece, which is disgusting. But when these hooks come out, these demons come and they play on people's sexual pleasure. And I think about how sex does hook people, and it can cause us, if we're not careful, to be like these individuals in the movie. Now, we won't see hooks come out and tear the flesh off of our bones, but it does that to us in the spirit, just like when it follows how you saw this demon terrorizing this girl throughout the movie. And we don't realize just how awful of a place we put ourselves in. And many complain about soul ties. They can't seem to forget the person. They have dreams about the person, even though they've moved on, they've dated other people. Because when you lay down with someone, you become one flesh. And masturbation isn't any safer as well, which is something that I've had people argue with me about before when I talk to them, that, oh, masturbation is harmless, it's just with yourself. And I can say that I'm not innocent in that way. Been in a relationship, but I have had that temptation, and I believe it was introduced to me through some form of past molestation, which is a story for another time, but it's something I struggled with. I felt a lot of guilt, and that's what it does when you're in sexual sin. It makes you feel guilty, and it condemns you, and it opens the door for demonic entity. One terrifying thing that happened to me in my disobedience was I was tempted, and I tried to resist the pull, but I gave in to my flesh rather than seeking Yahweh. And as I was in the act, I started to see a charred-faced demon smiling at me and walking closer to me. And I realized that the further I went with it, it was as if I was feeding this entity. And I was disgusted, and I repented of what I did, and realized that masturbation isn't just something that you do with yourself. It is literal sex with demonic spirits. And to some, that sounds crazy, but I saw the proof in that moment. And shortly after I saw that spirit, I was attacked with sleep paralysis, and in my dream, I dreamt that I died in a car crash and ended up undersea marrying this spirit. And I realized that this is one way that people invite spirit spouses or incubuses and succubuses to attack them during sleep paralysis. Now, I don't think that was the only cause of why I experienced sleep paralysis for as long as I did, but I definitely think that had I been more obedient, I would have had less occurrences, because my disobedience almost always opened the door. I was almost always attacked after I did that, and it's disgusting to look back on, but I'm thankful that I've been shown this. And trauma, sexual sin, those are just two huge ways. As I said with trauma, the same with sexual sin. And the best thing you can do, again, is take it to Yahweh, be 100% honest. He understands, and in 1 Corinthians 6:18 it says, "Flee fornication, every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body." So it says to flee, meaning if you're being tempted, flee from it. If there's a man or woman who's tempting you, cut them off. Don't try to entertain them, save them. Pray for them from a distance, but don't try to entertain it. If you're having wet dreams or incubus or succubus encounters, pray about it, cut it off. Don't try to wait and see what you can find out from it. If you're struggling with masturbation and you need to get rid of your internet or cable to stop watching pornography, or create a filter to help, which I know that doesn't work nowadays because children are able to access it even with these filters. But do everything in your power and pray to make sure that you don't fall into that trap, because to me, that movie with Pinhead and all these demons, flaying the flesh off of these people or sexually immoral both is what happens to us in the spirit, and it's something you don't want to be caught in. And also, in John 8:34 it says, Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. Again, you don't want to be a slave to any sin. It doesn't matter what the sin is, but sexual sin really does destroy you from the inside out. And the last topic that I want to address is the Jezebel Spirit. And the reason why is because I mention the Jezebel Spirit often depicted as a female, and I've likened her to a succubus, which is more seductive, and that's how I envision Jezebel. And there is that element, but the real purpose of the Jezebel Spirit, what she sets out to do, and she can work through men, I've seen her work through men, is it's false religion, and it's trying to get people to stray from the worship of Yahweh. In 1 Kings 18:4 it says, For it was so, when Jezebel cut off the prophet of the Lord, that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50 in a cave and fed them with bread and water. Here we see that Jezebel wanted to kill prophets, and Obadiah took 100 of them and hid them in a cave. That was her purpose, was to kill prophets, and that's what she does. Her worst enemy are prophets of the Lord. She hates them. Why? Because they prophesy against her false religion. And her false religion is oftentimes worship of other gods like Baal or Moloch or any of these other deities, or worship of self. And this is what we see with this narcissism. In Revelation 2:20 it says, Notwithstanding I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which called herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Again, she is teaching idolatry. The first commandment is, Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And this is what the Jezebel Spirit works to do, is to seduce others into putting other gods before Yahweh. So that's what her purpose is. That's what she functions to do. And I have had a really skewed perception of the Jezebel Spirit, and I've seen it at work. And we see this cult mentality, especially here on the internet, talked about the 501c3 and the churches and all the lies that the media perpetuates. And people honestly have moved away from that now and are sick of that. But we also must be careful not to get caught up in people worship and be so tied to an individual, because I've seen people spewing out false doctrine and people seeing it exposed, seeing the biblical evidence against it, and still following an individual because they're so in love with them, like they are with a celebrity. And it's sad, but that is something that is a new growing problem. And I always say with myself, if I say something that's backwards, that goes against scripture, then remove yourself from me. Unsub. Your salvation is more important than anyone else's feelings or ego. And tying it all together, trauma, sex, Jezebel, it all is in a way unrelated, but it is interrelated in the sense that we must always be careful to guard ourselves and to not allow circumstance to allow us to fall. But I hope that you enjoyed this week's message. You have a wonderful week, and God bless.